Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What single piece of legislation that's pending before this committee, this subcommittee or committee, would you think that we should pass that would have the most immediate positive effect on investment, job creation by your clients or your industry or your company?
As of now, I don't, our organization is not focused on a particular piece of legislation that you are currently considering other than, I don't know if the FERPTA legislation is part of what this subcommittee is focusing on. So I would say in terms of global investment, that would certainly be a piece of legislation that we would support. Generally on tax reform, again, it's about the lower rate and pushed in a transparent manner that is consistent and non-discriminatory.
Mr. Spitzer.
I was just down in Texas yesterday in Austin, so a great state. I think we have some water businesses down there. We own Ozarka Water, which is ours. I don't know all the legislation proposals that are in front of you. Obviously, a lower tax rate is very helpful. All the OECD countries, except for Japan, have a much lower rate than the U.S. does, and Japan is considering lowering its tax rate as well, below ours. So we're not competitive on a tax rate basis with other developed countries. Obviously, I've talked about 163J, and any further restrictions in that area would be very difficult for a company like ours to deal with, and I certainly think there should be some liberalization there concerning third-party borrowings that are simply guaranteed by our parent companies. It just doesn't make sense to me. A proposal that's been out there is this corporate residency proposal. I think it was sort of directed at inverted companies, which are pretty limited now, and maybe some hedge funds. It's a baby in a bathwater situation in my mind. As I understood the legislation as proposed here, any decision-making in the U.S., whether it's by corporate officers or not, might bring a foreign company into the U.S. for federal tax purposes. So, for example, I don't want to pick on Sony, but Sony's chairman, Howard Stringer, he spends time in Tokyo, spends time in London, spends time in New York. I think one-third, one-third. If all of a sudden under these proposals under corporate residency, Sony Japan woke up and found that it was a U.S. company, it would be devastating. All their affiliates around the world would be CFCs. Dividends to their Japanese shareholders would be subject to U.S. withholding taxes. And unlike so many other countries, or a few countries that have these sort of residency requirements, like the UK and Holland, it's very formalistic. The proposals in the U.S. Would be very difficult for anybody to deal with, and I think any advisor to any would have to recommend to their clients get every decision maker out of the U.S. pronto, because the consequences could be so horrific.
Number one would be absolutely the corporate tax rate. Simplification is also a big item on our list, just for the reason that it's a layer of fixed costs for most companies. And the smaller the companies, the bigger that burden is, and that hinders them from basically operating and doing business. Especially in a state like yours, we have a number of local vendors in Texas that work for our Little Rock, Arkansas facility. And we see the burden of just administering federal and state regulations, tax regulations, being so huge, just complying has become such a huge burden that it's a fixed cost that they cannot basically overcome.
Thank
you. We understand that Mr. Crowley and Mr. Brady are readying legislation to be reintroduced on FERPTA. We would urge that that be immediately passed. It would have tremendous salutary benefits. The guts of this legislation is legislation that passed the House in the last Congress with 402 votes in support of it. It died in the Senate, but perhaps we can move that, see that action this year. Incidentally, there is one thing that could be done immediately that would have very, very direct and almost immediate benefits, and that is this IRS notice dealing with how liquidating distributions are treated from private domestic REITs back to foreign investors. That could be done by the stroke of a pen administratively, And again, we understand that some members are looking at urging the Treasury Department to look in this area, and we absolutely urge you to do that as quickly as possible, and it would have immediate benefits. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman from